Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk. Time for the show. Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. Welcome back to Once a DJ. This week we're joined by a legend of the jazz dance scene, former Dingwalls resident, one of Kiss FM's longest serving DJs and master compiler, Mr. Patrick Forge. Patrick, how are you doing today?
I'm good, and I'm very grateful that you've asked me to do this. I'm looking forward to it.
No, appreciate you coming on. So I know you're somewhat familiar with the show and the format and stuff, so really it's just about getting into your story. So whereabouts did you grow up and where did music come into your life?
Well, I grew up in Ipswich, in Suffolk, a pretty classic provincial town in terms of its size and makeup and what have you. And I mean, music for me as a kid, I mean, I always go back to kind of like Sunday mornings being left kind of, I had a sister, but she was generally, I think my grandmother used to drag her to church on a Sunday or whatever. But anyway, I was always had these kind of Sunday memories of a Sunday morning when I was old enough to do it, of being able to work the record player and playing my parents' very limited collection of records and just getting lost in music, just really loving and savouring those moments and, you know, almost like feeling like I was entering another world. You know, I get so lost in it. And my mum, the only pop records we had were the Beatles records, not all of them, but some of them. I think me and my sister acquired the other ones, filled in the gaps later, and some classical. And I think I'm right in saying, although I know, yeah, I'm pretty sure, she also had Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Cole Porter Songbook, which I kind of got into latterly in my childhood. But this is, you know, I'm a kid here. This is under 10 years old or whatever, from 7 years old or something like that, you know. And yeah, and you know, the record player, which was a amazing old 1940s 50s cabinet thing called a Grundig 3D sound, because it had speakers in the sides and in the front, which had been slightly destroyed by my parents because they'd shoved it into a corner. So one of the speakers was just firing straight into a wall. So I'm not sure how effective that was.
Yeah.
But it sounded quite good, and you know, and it filled the room with sound, and that was all that I cared about. And I just literally just pranced about in the room, feeling very unself-conscious because I was left alone to do that, and discovering this, that I could have this kind of secret world and secret release of music. So that was really the starting point for me. And then, you know, I fell in love with various forms of pop music, and I had a sister who was 2 years older, so, you know, we bought, like, I remember pooling our pocket money and buying a David Bowie album, Aladdin Sane, as it came out, and that was, you know, a very exciting moment in my life. And yeah, and you know, and then I nurtured dreams of becoming, you know, a pop star or whatever. And you know, I started learning to play the guitar when I was about 11 or 12, and that was really my raison d'etre for a long time. That was what, you know, that was where I was aiming, and it was very amusing because I remember I had a school careers report when I was in my O-level year or whatever, and you know, and I wish I still had it, but it said something like Patrick wishes to break into the music business or something like that, you know. And it was like, it was kind of pitched in a way that this poor deluded fool thinks that he'll end up, you know, being able to work within music. Well, my dreams of pop stardom may not have come true, but I did find a way of having a life in music, which I'm eternally grateful for. So there you go.
So what was the early stuff you were learning on guitar? Because I learned at a similar age, and I had other mates that became far better guitarists because I was just strumming Beatles chords.
Yeah, mainly Beatles chords. We had the Beatles songbook, and it was a lot of fun working those out. But I think it was quite early on when I started experimenting with chords and started or seeing some of the jazzier chords that McCartney would insert into songs and go, ooh, this is a ninth, and all this kind of thing. So I sort of started making, firing my imagination, and I started kind of hearing it in music, if you see what I mean. I started realizing that there was this kind of world of harmony, if you like. And then, when you kind of get that revelation, I guess in a way, that's when you start hearing that a lot of music is quite pedestrian in terms of that it doesn't, not that there's anything wrong with that, because you can do amazing, brilliant things with, 3 major chords or whatever. But, that's a kind of fairly limited harmonic palette. And, and gradually I came to appreciate and understand a more advanced kind of harmony, and harmony's a big thing for me, and it's still a huge part of my taste in music. It's one of the reasons I love Brazilian music so much, for instance. But learning the guitar, I'm not a musician. I'm a failed musician. I switched from guitar to bass, what have you. But my fairly amateurish attempts at doing music were never really going to go anywhere. But it was good grounding for me to have, and I'm really glad that I've had that, because when I did eventually get into DJing, I had a kind of whole another compass, if you like, a whole nother orientation of the way that I listened to and understood music. Not that I was on the great level where I was going to kind of like write the chart of it straight away, but I could hear things from a technical perspective in terms of where they were harmonically, and I could hear the level of playing and all of these kind of things. So I had a kind of more of a ready reckoner of understanding it in that way, which a lot of people, some people don't, because they come to music from a totally different thing, and they come at it as purely as consumers and consumers of records, really, and of tunes,
I often find it interesting, because I could go on about the Beatles again, but we've already done an hour and a half.
I know,
with Greg, so we'll end up doing that again.
It's fun. It was so funny listening to the podcast you did with Greg, which is brilliant, by the way, and he's such a great natural raconteur. But it was so funny, those touchstones that he had and I had very much in terms of the Beatles, which he did his deep dive a bit later, but obviously it was the soundtrack of his childhood as well, and him talking about the pivotal Bowie on Top of the Pops Starman moment, which was like a huge thing for so many people. It's like, it's crazy when you read so many people's stories, and that was a kind of, there was a really pivotal moment in culture that you just don't get anymore, because obviously the nation gathered around the TV set for Top of the Pops, and much as I didn't have many mates at school at that time who were really into music, those that were, it was either Bowie's amazing, or it was what's all that about, so it was a real Marmite moment as well. It was a real division as well, if you like,
I suppose what you were saying as well, though, about the Beatles and the chords and things, it is a really good point, because they were known as this sort of 3-chord wonder, but there is some quite complex songwriting and stuff. And even in like Michelle, there's like the jazz bass solo. Who's doing a bass guitar solo? It's jazz,
Well,
so
I think
different.
McCartney was an incredible sponge, and I think like a lot of, one of the great things about people of that generation, as much as they were inspired by rock and roll and rhythm and blues, they'd been exposed to the great American songbook kind of sound, songwriting, that kind of school of songwriting, like the Cole Porters and the Gershwin, and all of that was part of the musical fabric of everybody's lives, because that's what was played on the radio a lot of the time, those kind of standards and things. So I think an appreciation of that kind of, that level, because there's such enormous craft in those songs. You can go, but the reason they're standards and the reason they're so great is they're so brilliantly crafted, that these guys were kind of like on a really sophisticated level. if you like.
Yeah, some of the harmony and some of that stuff's amazing.
These guys were, they were, if you like, proper musicians who'd done plenty of study before. Whereas, the generations that followed, the pop generations from the Beatles onwards, who were writing their own songs, they were learning all this stuff, and they started off with the basics and they learned how to play rock and roll because that's fairly simple, But obviously McCartney was somebody who was, very early on, understood and was interested in other forms of music, and they did things like Besame Mucho and things like covers of that in their early days. So obviously there was that influence as well,
Yeah, because I think with me from my guitaring and stuff, because I played brass when I was young,
right?
So it is interesting. Like I had a sort of probably like a grade 5 or just below grade 5 sort of understanding of theory and chords and stuff like that, but I kind of never knew quite enough to be accomplished, and I knew too much to be interesting. I just sat in this really like pedestrian zone.
Yeah. I think it's hard to break on through to that higher level, isn't it? It's funny you should say. Before I actually played guitar, I really, this was part of my early fascination, or with kind of with jazz, but also with the Roxy Music had a sax player, I was really into and David Bowie played the sax, so I was really into saxophone. So when my opportunity came to learn an instrument at school, I said, can I learn saxophone? And they said no, but you can learn clarinet, and maybe you can progress to saxophone from that. And I did learn clarinet for a while, and my first clarinet teacher was Brian Eno's uncle.
Right.
Because Brian Eno is from my part of the world. He's from Suffolk himself, And his uncle taught me, and he was a beautiful old man, and he was an incredible teacher. Unfortunately, he retired about a year after I started learning, and I acquired another teacher who rubbed me up the wrong way. This is also part of my history, was my endeavours to learn music kept on being thwarted by coming against awful teachers who who I felt kind of wanted to belittle me more than they actually wanted to impart anything useful. So, So yeah, my second clarinet teacher was not very inspirational, so I kind of quickly dropped that.
I think woodwind instruments as well. Like my daughter started learning the flute at school, and it's like these things are so hard because they're not linear instruments.
No,
the piano's linear, isn't it?
Yeah.
You start at the left, it's low. You go to the right, it's high. On a guitar, it's
Well, the
sort of
guitar,
like an array.
well, I mean, this is the whole thing. I've got one of my twin boys is quite adept on piano, and I keep on showing to him. I said, look, this is quite simple because all the harmony stuff you can work it out. You can just count up from the root note, and you are. It's all fairly obvious and it's graphic, and you can understand it. Whereas the guitar is a matrix, is a weird matrix that takes forever to get your head around because of the way it's tuned. So it's funny how it's like the principal instrument of kind of, of popular music for so many people, and it's the first thing that everybody picks up. But it's the hardest one to learn and understand music on.
Yeah.
Guitar doesn't make sense of music, it complicates it, It certainly doesn't simplify anything, And it's a ball ache to learn that involves a lot of pain in your wrist and fingers and what have you,
Yeah, shredding the front of your fingers and stuff. So what came next for you musically? What was the next after that, the Bowie and the Beatles?
Well, it's funny actually because I look back on this on my earlier tastes, and I mean, it's funny because I quite early on I was really into buying records, and I really quickly realised that if you bought either second-hand records or records that nobody wanted in sales, for instance, that you could buy them really cheap, and that was great because you could be a bit more speculative about what you bought, and so for instance I remember very I was probably, I don't know how old I was, but whenever it came out, I guess I remember buying a Brian Auger's Oblivion Express album in the sale in the record department of a department store in Ipswich, and it was like 50p or 99p or something like that. I thought, oh, that's worth a punt. It's got a great cover, and it was a jazz fusion record, which I didn't really understand what it was at the time, but I liked it, and what have you. But when I went to, I kind of changed schools at the age of 12 or 13, but it was funny because so many of my peers were kind of into heavy and progressive rock. That was the kind of, and I didn't like a lot of that stuff, but I kind of tried to find things that I did like that they would relate to, but I guess in a way my tastes had already started to be quite eclectic. My sister was a couple of years older. She'd started buying, more different things like, some soul records and what have you, So yeah, I did have a kind of brief flirtation with kind of prog, I suppose, but that I quickly grew out of that. And then of course, I was that age when punk happened, that it had a fairly seismic effect, just not necessarily in terms of musically, but obviously you just felt it culturally, and as a kind of natural rebel, if you like, I was just drawn into its attitude and its spirit and what have you, and it, and there was that sense of that there was something going on, and I loved the whole thing about the kind of DIY ethos of it. It just made the musical world seem more possible, whereas it had always seemed incredibly, like these far-flung pop stars that you would never attain their level,
Yeah.
And then suddenly it was like, wow, these people are just going out there and making a record, and they're doing it, and so I was drawn into all of that. So yeah, that was a big thing for me. It was funny because a guy I was playing in bands with, who was a drummer, he got a job as a Saturday boy at the local radio station, Radio Orwell, which was also a big insight for me because he was very friendly with a guy called Andy Archer, who'd come over from Radio Caroline, which was the kind of pirate radio on a ship,
Yeah.
And he was, he'd come from there, more kind of hippie, progressive ethos and what have you. And he did a Saturday afternoon show on Radio Orwell, which we often sat in on, which was great because it was one of my kind of insights into that whole thing of, wow, you can play music you love he played what he loved, but a lot of the listenership weren't necessarily that down with it, but he was like, well, I'm doing it anyway. So he was really into the whole kind of, the more of the kind of, the Doobie Brothers, Crosby, Stills and Nash, all Van Morrison, all of that kind of, that kind of the more soulful end of rock music, which he was my kind of introduction to a lot of that stuff. And I loved a lot of that music, and I heard it first there, but my mate Robin having a Saturday job there meant that he was, one of his jobs was working in the record library they had there, and they were sent all the promos. And of course, they didn't play any punk records at that time. So every punk single that came out, he just took home with him, So he had this incredible collection. I mean, God knows what it would be worth now, because it was like, this incredible collection of all the punk 7-inches as they came out, So, we listened to those as a bit of a laugh. But funnily enough, he was somebody who, he was kind of pulling me. And the other part of what he was listening to was kind of jazz rock and jazz fusion, He was kind of Weather Report and Colosseum and stuff like that, So, and I was playing, and by that time I was playing bass, and we were kind of, a rhythm section, and that was where our tastes were going. But at the same time, and it's so funny, isn't it? Because I think when I think about that period from kind of like 1977 through till, I don't know, the mid 80s or whatever, or I'd say 97 to 82 really, because 82 was when I started. It was just so wide open, and I didn't feel that there was any contradiction in liking all of these different kinds of music, I was just kind of like, and I didn't want it to be tribal, and it was quite tribal amongst culture, socially out there in the world that I lived in. But one of the things that, when it got to post-punk and things started to kind of, and those barriers started to break down, it was like, yes, this is what we want. We want to live in a world where we can do anything. Do you know what I mean? And because it was so, and I remember, like being in Ipswich as a 17-year-old walking through the town centre with my kind of David Bowie affected haircut and whatever I was wearing at the time. And this girl stopped me in the street and said, "Oi, are you punk or soul?" And that for me was almost like a crowning moment. It's like, yeah, I really cracked it here, because because she's confused as to what I am, and that was where I was at by that time. It was like, what was I, punk or soul? I wasn't quite sure,
What was Ipswich like then for integration and people accepting different tribes and things like that?
Well, it was interesting because I think microcosms are kind of often interesting in that respect, because it is all quite contained, and because because there's only a certain amount of opportunities or outlets for anything, whether it be youth clubs or venues where you can perform or whatever, there's always quite a lot of, cross-pollination between people and tribes, And, it's funny when you think about the kind of Bob Marley punky reggae party thing. Well, that definitely happened in Ipswich, because certainly when I was growing up there, not so much the case now, but there was a much bigger Caribbean population. They all moved away, probably because it was so racist, I don't know, whatever, but there was in those days. So we had some really good reggae bands came out of Ipswich, including Jar Warrior, who I think people think of as being a London band, because I think they all moved to Brixton, But so I remember them, and we had a kind of like our semi-successful punk band, The Addicts, and I certainly remember going to gigs where Jar Warrior and The Addicts were on the same bill, and and so that was a kind of common thing. And then kind of later on, I remember when some of the people that I'd started playing with, like Robin and a keyboard player I'd worked with, John, they kind of got into the kind of local soul boy jazz funk scene, and so they were playing in one of their bands and I was playing in one of my slightly weird post-punk bands, and we would kind of we would share a bill, so it was like it was not seen as, it was, you wanted to kind of to merge those things, because that was the only way you get enough people into your gig sometime or whatever,
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's ONCEADJ10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some Once a DJ 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from onceadj.bigcartel.com, and if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. When you were just mentioning about bands, you talk about getting into Weather Report.
Yeah.
Weather Report's quite technical, isn't it? Because I think this is something I want to get into with you around jazz and how accessible some of it is and some of it isn't. As you're someone who's learning bass and you're then starting listening to Weather Report and Jaco Pastorius, how soul destroying is it? Just listening and being like, wow, he's good.
I remember all kinds of bass players who really, really excited me, but at the same time just made me feel like I was completely inadequate and I would never get there. And funnily enough, as much as I did love Pastorius, and it's a complicated part of my story actually, because Robin, who was the drummer who kind of introduced me to Weather Report, I eventually left Ipswich because he was at university in Polytechnic as it was in Kingston, and my mission was that I would go to Kingston to study because I wanted to form a band with him, which never kind of happened. But he was a huge Weather Report fan, and we shared a flat, and his incessant playing of Weather Report actually really got to me after a while. And I had a whole period of a few years when I just could not hear Weather Report. It would just kind of make my flesh crawl. And then, eventually I was able to kind of almost reintroduce myself to them as being a completely new band, because it was like I was hearing it all afresh by that time. But certainly, and I can remember him just playing those records. And I remember I think it's called A Remark You Made. It's a Pastorius kind of solo, and it goes meow, bow, 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 bow. And that one, it just kind of like every time. It's that particular tune, I still can't kind of hear it, because I just remember him just playing them. Like somebody can really bore you with a record, if they just play it too much and it's not what you want to listen to at the time. So yeah. But yes, but that whole kind of, it took me a long time to kind of assimilate. I was, going back to buying my Brian Auger album when I was a kid. It took me a long time to start really having the ears to be able to digest a lot of jazz fusion and stuff. It was quite complex music, and And I totally appreciate that it's sometimes it's music that can turn a lot of people off because of that thing. But eventually I got my head around it, that's for sure.
Yeah, like I find it with Frank Zappa as well. Some of his stuff I think is really cool, but some stuff it's just too clever for me.
Yeah. Well, I hear that as well.
Yeah. So, was it Kingston that you moved to then?
Well, yeah. So basically, I was playing in bands as a bass player. I think the last band I had was called Lux Function. It was basically me, a synth player, and a drum machine, with me kind of playing slap bass, and Robin, who was the drummer I'd worked with, he came and played congas on some of our gigs as well, and it was the summer of '82, which was a great year, and it was actually when I did some of my first DJing as well. But and I just suddenly thought, and I've been kind of quite dedicated to Ipswich, to staying there and trying to make things happen culturally there, because whenever we put on, it was always a sense that there was a bit of a scene, and that that it was quite exciting in its own way. But I just kind of got to a point where I was just like, boom, no, I can't do this anymore. I need to go somewhere else. And I've always been I feel very drawn to London anyway. My dad's was a proper Cockney, if you like, so I felt ancestrally it was my homeland. And I know Kingston isn't quite London, but we'll get to that. But I suddenly, literally at the last moment, applied to Kingston Poly to do a degree, because I thought I can't do it. I'd taken 2 years off after my A-levels and messing around doing music, and I thought, no, I need to go and do a qualification. And at the time it was very much about forming a band with Robin. But as I said, at that time I'd also done some of my first summer of '82 was the year when I did my first ever proper DJing. Which was funny, and I don't quite know how it came about, but there was a venue in Ipswich called the Albion Mills. It was a pub, and they had a classic kind of pub basement, with little alcoves and what have you, And it was a jazz club. The guy that ran it, Derek, was a proper jazz head, and little known to me, I really was not appreciative of how immersed he was in the British jazz scene at the time, because various artists who I totally admire played there on a regular basis, and I was kind of associating them with being a kind of jazz world that I didn't, even though I was kind of getting into jazz, I was thinking of British jazz as being these kind of blokes in cardigans with pipes, and kind of it just somehow I'd built up this antipathy towards it, and we had a really funny relationship with Derek, because he really took the piss out of us as being these young kids who would kind of do our weird bands and what have you. But there was a couple of guys who were in the year above me at school, and I think they were at uni already, but in the summer they decided that we'd do a DJ night in the Albion Mills. Nearly we're always doing live on a Thursday night, and they knew I had records by that time, and so they said, come and DJ with us. And it was a funny thing, because it was just a thing, but I loved doing it, and it was completely eclectic. It was, in terms of the kind of stuff, eclectic in quite a cool way, I suppose now, but we didn't know that at the time, the fact that we were playing this kind of weird mixture of kind of post-punk dance, like A Certain Ratio and all of that kind of related type of things, alongside things like Gwen Guthrie, and then things like Planet Rock when that came out, and all of this kind of mad, and and things like Nina Simone as well, and kind of some more retro stuff, even Louis Jordan. We just mashed it all together because it just felt natural to do that, and it was a lot of fun. So that was one of my first ever DJ experiences. But at that time, it was absolutely not even remotely in my head that it was an avenue that I would later pursue. And it was really, I think Greg might have said something along these lines as well, about the experience of DJing when you start, when you're kind of playing, and especially for me, because Ipswich is a very kind of small scene, so like everyone I knew was out there having fun, and I was kind of trapped behind the decks trying to provide the entertainment. And it was like, they were having a lot. They seemed like they were having a lot more fun than I was, and I was still very sketchy about how I approached the technical aspect of. Well, I kind of blended records together, and it was, a Citronic console with Garrard turntables, so it wasn't, the kind of level that we got used to later. So, but it was a good initiation, and like I said, I think we were playing what now in retrospect might be considered a very hip playlist, but I think it was just kind of completely accidental, coincidental that we were,
Was part of that, do you think? Because I think about this sometimes, because I overthink, probably because I don't DJ as much, I really overthink what I'm going to DJ at places and stuff like that, whereas those first few sort of gigs I was doing, I remember I closed out a like a festival up at a uni campus up near where I'm from, and I was playing all sorts of things, but it was because I only probably had about 50 records. Like I didn't have an option, but what I played, I'd love to go back and hear the set, because I'm pretty confident it would have been pretty decent. And just a lot more varied than if I went and played somewhere tomorrow. You know, and you're not overthinking it and stuff. It's quite nice in a way.
But it's, I mean, you know, but that whole thing, because, you know, eclectic became a word which then eventually got used a lot in terms of, you know, to describe sometimes my style or a style of DJing that, you know, ranged across genres or whatever. But it was something that, you know, for me, like in that kind of, very much in that kind of post-punk ethos, was that you know, anything could go, and there was no reason why you shouldn't be able to blend this with that or what have you, you know.
Yeah,
definitely.
Did you enjoy the, because you were saying, you know, you were mindful that people were having more fun. Did you still enjoy the DJing, or was it a chore?
No, not a chore, but it was well, I suppose a little bit challenging, you know, just because that thing of like, oh shit, the record's running out, I haven't got another, you know. It's kind of like you haven't quite got down with the kind of the basics of like of how you have to, of what the mindset you have to have, whereas that's kind of second nature to me now because of the 10,000 hours rule or whatever, and what have you. But then, you know, but it was interesting because I think, you know, there's something very beautiful in the unself-conscious selection process, you know, and because I had no real reference points in terms of comparing much to, I mean, I was, you know, I heard other DJs, I had been exposed to some DJs at that point, but not that much, you know, so it was no way that I was thinking about, oh, I need to try and copy that or whatever. It was just like, no, I'm going to play this now or whatever, you know. And it was probably a much more, you know, it wasn't so much about tempo or style, it was more about mood, you know. I think that was the thing, you know. It's like, I want to play this record next because emotionally it makes sense rather than for any other reason, you know.
Nice. Yeah, because sometimes BPM can get in the way, can't it? 'Cause
oh, totally. And I never, you know, and it took me a long, you know, it's not where I come from as a DJ, you know. Even though I'm kind of completely down with doing that now, and I've got to that point where I can hear what BPM a record is almost straight away, or within, you know, roughly. It certainly wasn't the way I thought back then.
So in those 2 years after your A levels, were you doing any jobs or part-time jobs or anything?
Yeah.
What sort of stuff?
Yeah, I did. I actually worked in a warehouse at an engineering company for quite a while, actually, until they kind of made me redundant. So it was, for me, that was really quite liberating as well. You know, I just want, you know, the idea of having a weekly wage packet and being able to spend it on records.
Yeah.
Which I did pretty regularly on a Saturday. I remember there was a guy called Charlie Davey, who was the older brother of one of my sister's friends, and he was kind of like an old hippie type, and he opened a second-hand shop just literally on the same road as Ipswich's kind of main record shop, Parrot Records as it was at the time. So, you know, like on a Saturday, you know, kind of like in a rehearsal of what would come later in Soho, you know, you do the kind of record shop run, which might only be 2 shops. But I go to Parrot Records and then I go to Charlie's shop and buy records, you know. And that certainly that was instilled at that point, of that kind of the pleasure and the joy of just doing some record shopping and going home with a bag of records and the anticipation of being able to play them and get them on the turntable. That whole thing, which still kind of excites me to this day, you know, to an extent. That was very much instilled in me at that point. And, you know, I was, you know, I'd already started you know, like whereas most friends of mine had a few records, you know, I had a big shelf of records already, you know, so yeah. And I was buying all kinds of things at that point as well, you know, like, you know, whatever, sometimes random, sometimes whatever. But I got into quite early on. By that time I was probably kind of involved. I got to the point where I was doing things like, well, I was looking, and even if I wasn't buying them, I was reading, you know, like James Hamilton's column in Record Mirror, and I was looking very much looking at a lot of the charts in the back of Blues and Soul, and thinking, what the hell are these records these guys are playing, especially when I started realising some of it was more kind of jazz related. And as I kind of became aware of the idea of this notion of jazz dance and Latin music, which really fascinated me. So I would go into Parrot Records, or later Andy's Records, which opened up in Ipswich as well as the second main record shop. And Andy's actually had quite a decent jazz department. So like I remember really early on buying, just because I knew it was a significant album. I think I was probably only about 16. I bought Coltrane, Love Supreme in there. And then because I was into playing bass, and I was really completely drawn and fascinated by the sound of the upright bass, and I knew that Charlie Mingus was the number one kind of jazz bass player. So I went to the kind of Mingus section, and I found an album called Tuana Moods, and on the back it had a quote from him saying, "This is the best record I ever made." So I thought, well, I'm going to buy that one then, And that was a record that I completely, because it was kind of really quite different as a jazz record. I mean, they were quite heavy records for me, and I wasn't really assimilating this music, but at the same time, I was like, I understood that there was something there, and I began to hear it. Gradually, it made more and more sense to me. But even to my young ears, there was enough to make me think, I need to know this. I need to kind of explore it more.
Because Coltrane's not kind of simple jazz, is it?
No, certainly, and Love Supreme is a pretty heavy one. If that's your first Coltrane album, that could put you off for life.
Is that like hard bop stuff then?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I suppose Love Supreme veers towards a slightly freer approach as well. Even though I'd say it's very much within that kind of era of post or hard bop or whatever you want to call it. Because it's that's his getting off heroin and having a kind of spiritual revelation type of record. So. But yeah, I mean, it was funny because it wasn't until quite a lot later that I suddenly, that I kind of became like a Coltrane devotee, if you like. And if you look behind me, you can just probably see on the wall a picture where you can't see his face, but you can see his feet and his sax. So yeah, it took a while to really start to appreciate Train in the fullest. But yeah, even as a 16-year-old, I could hear there was something there. And I could hear there was something there very much in the voice of his saxophone. Yeah, I could hear like this human in it, and I could hear the anguish and the kind of, and that kind of, and I suppose quite early on I was kind of into that notion that that in music there could be anguish and joy at the same, that it could have these simultaneous emotions, that there could be pain and pleasure at the same time, all wrapped up in the same thing. So Coltrane was definitely that part of that thing. But the Mingus record that I bought, Tuana Moods, was because it was very much influenced by his trips to Tuana and by kind of Latin, by kind of, a kind of Latin music. But I was already as well at that stage fascinated by Latin music. So one of the things I would do when I went to Andy's Records, I'd go to the jazz record section and look for anything that seemed Latin, I mean, these records that I was seeing that people were playing in the charts in the back of Blue, I couldn't find those records, but I thought, well, let me see what I can find that's going to be a bit like. I was aware of this sound, even though I didn't really know what it was at the time, which was eventually I would understand as Latin jazz and Brazilian jazz and fusion and all of these things. But there were some records that I bought at that time, like for instance, Ray Barretto, Lacuna, which came out in, I don't know, whenever it was, but that was a new release at the time and had this amazing version of Stevie Wonder's Pastime Paradise, which I knew anyway because my sister had Songs in the Key of Life, and that was the Stevie album that I'd completely fallen in love with.
Is that the version with the really nice heavy percussion?
Yes. Yeah. Which, it's funny because that's a tune that I still play to this day. So that record's been with me a very long time. Another one was, there was a McCoy Tyner album called Leyenda de la Hora, The Legend of the Hour, which was very much a kind of Latin influenced album with a lot of orchestration on it as well, which again is something which, I got into big time later on. But these were kind of very much like introductory records to me as I started to feel my way into the music I would love it. But like I said, at that time, my awareness of whatever was going on in London in terms of DJs playing jazz, whether it was Paul Murphy or whether it was in Manchester and Colin Wilson and Colin Curtis, sorry, it was very sketchy. I didn't really know what was going on, although also around that time when I was still at school, like I had a girlfriend called Sylvia, and she was like a properly into the whole jazz, funk, soul scene. So we would sometimes get another mate of us to drive us down to clubs in Essex, like the Barn at Braintree. So I was, and I went out, and I'd go to clubs, and so I had certain records that I already knew and had heard, and it was weird because I was kind of into disco as well, it's that generation. We grew up with Chic and all of those things, those records were just like second nature records to us because you heard them all the time, and I remember there was a little pub that we used to go to on a Friday night where the landlord used to play some records, and he would play all of those things, and grew up dancing to all of that stuff. And I loved dancing. I always loved dancing. But yeah, so I started going out, and I remember going to these clubs and thinking, wow, it's interesting. They're playing, but my taste in jazz, if you like, was already a bit heavier, and like certainly I remember Sylvia lending me her copy of the Crusaders, Free as the Wind, and I just thought, this is too lightweight for me at the time. I wasn't kind of into it, It took me a while to kind of get my head round and all of that. Maybe when I understood the history of the Crusaders and where they'd come from, and that they'd previously been the Jazz Crusaders, and I kind of understood the whole lineage of it, as I do these days. It would have, I appreciated it in a different way. But at that time, and I suppose there was also this kind of like, I was still in that kind of post-punk hangover, and there was something that I identified in soul boy culture which I really wasn't into.
Right.
Which was kind of like this kind of, for me, there was a lot of this kind of like, nouveau riche, driving XR3s, going to wine bars, this kind of whole kind of cultural ethos of that thing. And, one of the things I realised from looking at blues and soul was that there was a kind of pretty naff element to the soul scene, on the weekenders and wet t-shirt competitions and all kinds of shenanigans like that, and these were the days when, DJs were talking on the mic a lot and all of that kind of stuff. And I was just not into any of that stuff. I just like, nah, that just didn't appeal to me. I probably didn't really understand it, and I probably wasn't really being exposed to the better end of it. So, I didn't get really where it was all coming from. I've studied that history in retrospect since, and realised that I missed out on an awful lot. But at the time, that was what my head was saying. So that's kind of where I went. So I was, funnily enough, that whole thing about jazz funk, it took me a while to kind of reappraise that, because my idea of jazz funk was a band like Defunct or something like that, who were out of Chicago and were playing really quite heavyweight, grinding, but with a lot of jazz, and, and not something that was kind of like light and these kind of fluffy little lines and stuff like that, which is how I heard a lot of that music then. But having said that, there were certain aspects of it that I loved immediately. I mean, there were records, like Freeze. When Freeze came out, I thought they were brilliant. I just thought there was an energy to it, that I just immediately got. And Southern Freeze was just a record that just like, I just love this record straight away,
I suppose with Southern Freeze as well, it comes into what you said before about being able to have the sort of anguish and the joy. Yeah. Because it's almost a bit kind of, is melancholy the right word? Yeah. Well, there's an aspect. Still
well, of course, this is the whole thing about music, is when you get into that harmonic thing, you realise that when you're you can deal with a minor tonality, but it can be very joyous, and that's a massive part of what Brazilian music is about as well. What the Brazilians call saudade, this sense of longing in the music. So there's kind of melancholia and joy at the same time, which I think is really a massive thing. That's a huge thing for me. It's a big key to my taste in music, is that thing.
Once a DJ is brought to you with the support of Vinyl Underground Record Store. Since 1993, VU has been shipping new and used underground house, techno, disco, hip-hop, soul and more worldwide from Northampton in the UK. They're your go-to store for upfront releases, repressed classics and deep digging for undiscovered gems. And they're a great crew to deal with who really care about the music and their customers. To show the support to the Once a DJ community, they're giving you 10% off your next order. Just head to vinylunderground.co.uk and use the code ONCEADJ10 at checkout. You also get free UK delivery on all orders over £100. That's 1todj10 at vinylunderground.co.uk. I wanted to create a product for the listeners to be able to support the show and for the guests as a token of gratitude for being on, so I've teamed up with Sure Shot Shop to create some 1todj 45 RPM adapter clamps. These are my weapon of choice as a 45 adapter, as they add stability and grip to aid you in any setup. These are available for £25 each plus flat fee postage from 1todj.bigcartel.com, and if you'd like to see the other models you can buy and also customise, check out sureshotshop.com. So, what was it you went to study at the Polytechnic then?
Yeah, well, that's a funny one because I was always an English scholar. Words has always fascinated me. I love poetry. I wrote poetry, and I always assumed that if I, even though I'd left school, I thought, well, if I'm going to do a degree, I'll do a degree in English. But because I applied really late, I applied to do English, and they said, sorry, the English course is full, but you can do history of ideas if you like. And I was like, what? What's history of ideas? One of those serendipitous things that I'm incredibly grateful for, because it was a fantastic course, and it was a perfect degree for me to do at the time, and I gained so much from it. It helped me so much in terms of understanding the world, the history of the world, where I was at, where understanding politics, giving me tools of political philosophy to understand politics on a kind of more fundamental level. When you've studied the history of, you know where liberalism comes from, all of the, it just helped, everybody should have, that stuff should be in everybody's education, Well, after all, if you're voting for something, that you don't really understand it. No, I'm not saying, of course, it's kind of conceptual or whatever, but some kind of grounding in those ideas would be really useful for most people, because I think a lot of time it passes people by. But yeah, it was an incredibly great degree for me to do, and I'm eternally grateful that the English course was full, and it was a pretty rubbish English course, to be honest with you, when I spoke to some of the other people who did that course. So yeah, it was a really great thing, and it really suited me, and I ended up writing my thesis on jazz culture,
Right,
which was, I think, the title of my thesis was trying to remember, the culture and philosophy of jazz and the roots of disaffiliation.
so what does that mean?
So what it was about was the way in which, if you like, so many things that became part of counterculture and subculture came initially out of jazz culture and black culture or society. It was about, and there were various texts that I used that were quite seminal in terms of being able to write that. Norman Mailer's The White Negro, which was all about that idea of white people falling in love with this notion of a black. I'm not, it's a really interesting and very sensitive subject in a way, but I was approaching it fairly naively at the time. But at the same time, I was kind of getting quite clued up. By that time, I was living in a squat in Vauxhall, and I was surrounded by people who were very politically motivated. So, concepts like cultural imperialism and the whole notion of, as a white person being involved in black music, that was something that I understood it on those levels from the get-go, if you like. So it was kind of but it was obviously, what I was trying to do was write a thesis that would work for my degree,
Yeah.
So it had to be, I had to kind of wrap it up in a kind of academic understanding. But it was just being able to kind of go headlong into all of these subjects that really fascinated me, and be able to reading books about the history of counterculture, looking at the the 50s and the folk and jazz movements in Britain, the beatniks, of course, all of these things that kind of fed into the the kind of forerunners of what eventually happened in the 60s and what have you. So it was something that I got really passionate when I was writing my thesis. I got really, really into it, and I was really searching around for a really good, pretentious enough, academic enough, if you like, text about jazz. And then I was saved by the great Joachim Ernst Brent, who was actually a kind of very involved in the German label MPS, who released a lot of great jazz fusion and jazz records in the 70s. But he wrote quite a lot as well, and I had this book, and it was just like a coffee table jazz, one of those kind of coffee table jazz books. But in the back of it, there was this essay he'd written called "Glosses on a Philosophy of Jazz," and this is where I need to go. I need to have some of this to kind of to make it all make sense, And it did, and it was very interesting because he was really talking about a lot of the whole ideas in which jazz breaks down linear time, if you like, the fact that swing and the notion of the fact that that you're moving, or if the most linear music would be kind of marching music, because the rhythm would just be so kind of pedestrian, and jazz was all about the offbeats, the nuance, the push and the pull of the swing, all of those things, and how in a sense that plays with, obviously time still goes on, but you're playing within time. You're moving time back and forth. You're creating things within linear time that aren't quite so linear, that emphasize different things and what have you. So it's just, there's more ambivalence, if you like, in the notion of time and that's something that that I understood anyway, and it kind of fed into my notion of groove, I suppose, in the idea that when you have a rhythm, it can be, that you can play it in a variety of ways, that there could be a way of playing it where it would be very ungroovy because the beats would be really like that, nailed down to where they should be. But you could also sit back on it and it could become, or you could push it, but whatever. But this notion that there was some play within this kind of rigid structure of time, and that helped create the magic, if you like, and this slight sense of dislocation, and that sense of dislocation is part of the way when you hear it that you kind of able to enter into a less linear world, the fact that time and rhythm is working in with you, and obviously with polyrhythm, when you're getting a lot of rhythmic information at once, that whole thing of your being, and it's, the most reductive version of that might be something like psy-trance, and the most advanced version of it might be something like, like African percussion, and kind of like some of the kind of records that Art Blakey made with a whole host of African percussionists, where it was like this real dense rhythmic intensity, and there'd be this kind of thing within it that was moving, there was kind of an emotional thing moving, and that was why. I heard, and I kind of really identified with that thing, and that's something that it's, that's really fundamental to my understanding of music as well. That rhythm, that aspect of rhythm, Yes, and I hear that. You can hear that within, don't get me wrong, you can still create a lot of those feelings with programmed, with house music, for instance. A lot of that thing can come in. It doesn't have to be vastly complex or played for it to have elements of those syncopations which does that thing,
Yeah, well, you get it with scratching as well, because it's, the phrasing and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
It's interesting hearing your sort of abstract, sort of conceptual understanding of jazz beyond, modal structures and scales and chromatics.
Well, I think there's so many aspects to jazz, but the understanding of jazz. Listen, I'm not a musician on that level, right? The whole idea of running chord changes and the level of technical proficiency that's needed to be able to do that. The old school, if you like, essence of what jazz improvisation is about is well beyond my level in terms of musicianship. But I understand it conceptually. But the thing is that within obviously with jazz you've got this whole the jazz quartet is this incredible at its highest form, or even a trio. But once you've got those elements working together of rhythm, improvisation, harmony, yet those things are all constantly being played with and shifted or what have you, it's this amazing organic thing that does dissolve a lot of that kind of linear nature of, maybe not of time, but of the way that a lot of other music works. That's the thing that draws me into that music. And as I've grown and developed my ears, I've got an understanding or a feeling for what I love. I can't pretend, it's taste at the end of the day. It's, I know what I love within that thing, and I know when it happens, and I hear it when it happens.
Yeah. So how was squat life, and did you have your records there, and were you ever worried you'd get kind of turfed out and stuff?
Constantly worried about theft and being turfed out and all of those things. And yes, I did have my records there, and I was on the ground floor, and so when I was playing music, it was pretty obvious that I had a fairly decent hi-fi in a group. But it was interesting. It was a what is now kind of quite a historic squat area. It was kind of famous. Right. It was called Vauxhall Grove and Bonington Square in Vauxhall. Part of my raison d'etre of wanting to be there was that I was at college in Kingston, and by that time I was getting really into going clubbing, and I wanted to be closer into central London. And Vauxhall just seemed like the absolute perfect location, because I could like walk into the West End virtually from Vauxhall, and I could get on the train to go to college. So bingo, brilliant. And then through a friend of a friend of a friend, I heard about that there was this big squat area, and this friend knew somebody who lived there. And one day we went round to their squat and went and chatted to them, and said, I said kind of casually, slightly, inappropriate, well, not inappropriately, but slightly, was there any space here? Can I move? And they said, no, listen, we're full up. Which of course they weren't, because the whole thing about these greedy squatters is they'd all want more space, and you'd have like 3 people in the house, and you'd have a floor each or whatever, But they said there's 2 girls down the road, and they're just the 2 of them there, and you never know, you might be able to move in there. And literally, it was like, I thought, I'm just going to grab this opportunity, tempus fugit, not tempus fugit. What's the word for seize the day? Yeah, well, anyway, I thought I seized the day, and I went round there with a big bottle of wine and knocked on the door and said, hello, I'm looking for somewhere to live. And they very kindly let me in, and we chatted and we got on, and I moved into a squat, which was just perfect, because firstly, it meant that my grant would go a lot further. Secondly, it meant that I could go clubbing, So it was just perfect. But yeah, I mean, it was slightly precarious, squat life, and it did worry me. And it was funny, because when I actually moved in there, I don't think they were actually paying for any services at all. I don't think they had any, I think they were hooked up to gas and electricity, but they somehow had managed to do that without having registered accounts. And I did actually, usher in a transformation to actually paying some bills as well, just made me feel like I was a little bit more legit. But it was very much part of the spirit of those times. I mean, I knew that that some of the bands that I was really into were kind of squatters, like Scritti Politti. They come out of that London squat scene. 23 Skidoo, they came out of the London squat scene. Simon Booth, who went on to do Weekend and Working Week, was a musician that would be quite pivotal for me as well, in a way. He was a squatter too. So that was very much, and it was that whole really interesting thing in the early 80s of I see it as being, in a way, they was kind of like the last throes of counterculture, in a way, before the whole world just got completely nailed down by neoliberal economics, and what have you. Like Thatcher had come in, and we knew the world was changing, but there was still enough room in the margins, and things were still, and people were still, people were signing on and doing stuff. Do you know what I mean? They were, having enough money to live and finding little ways, ducking and diving, earning a few quid on the sly here and there, or doing creative projects. But there was, and I think that's just a really healthy thing for society, to have those margins where people can do those kind of things. It's really sad that doesn't really exist anymore. But it was a great time, and I'm incredibly grateful to have kind of lived through that period. So it was kind of a weird mixture, squat life, of kind of, so much drugs around. It was insane. A lot of heroin, which was kind of pretty depressing. And a lot of very politically motivated people, like I said earlier. And a lot of music and a lot of creativity. I mean, there was in this because there was these two squares that were both squatted, Bonington Square and Vauxhall Grove. There was this place in the corner of one of this kind of they were all terraced houses, but there was this one squat in the corner that was called, I can't remember, called the Club or whatever. But it was basically, they kind of hollowed it out so that like all the floors were just like it was almost like an Elizabethan theatre or something like that. So there were just like floors on the periphery of the. And the staircase, and so you could kind of, and there was a kind of central area, and there would just basically be anarchic happenings there, of a kind of completely, spontaneous nature, which I loved. I just loved all that whole kind of thing about it. And one of the bands that I was really into in that kind of period, as much as I was listening to Loose Ends and Change and what have you like that, I loved Rip, Rig and Panic, who were ultimate kind of jazzy Bristol post-punk. It was where Nena Cherry and Andy Oliver, who's of course on the telly now and does food programmes, who I'm friends with on social media, who I'm always slightly starstruck when I'm engaged with them, because I just remember following Rip, Rig and Panic around to various gigs, and just kind of like been thinking, because they would just do these really, really mad improvised shows, where you just knew you never knew quite what was going to happen, and occasionally it would merge into a tune, and you knew they'd rehearsed that bit.
Yeah.
But other bits just weren't, and at that time in my life, I was that very obvious kind of freedom of expression was something that was still very much part of where I thought things should be at, if you like, and it was what drew me to the next kind of phase, I suppose, which was warehouse parties. Was a kind of adjunct to squatting.
Yeah,
is the kind of the one night squatting a venue and moving in a sound system and buying and bringing in beer and having a party. And that really, really excited me when I suddenly realised there was this scene of warehouse parties.
Was it quite a different feel to, because we've not sort of talked about the clubbing that you mentioned before. Was it quite a different feel?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the notion of rocking up at a kind of warehouse, and it was all be a bit grimy, and the music that was played and everything, it was just like it always felt like, going to, there was certainly the first clubs that I went to still had the hangover of being discos, if you like.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And then this was the antithesis of the disco.
Yeah. Is this mid-80s?
Yeah, I suppose, early to mid-80s. I started, around about the time when I was finishing my degree and what have you, and that period just really, that was all part of my just getting an incredible enthusiasm for what was going on culturally, in terms of, I felt like in London there was something that was really buzzing, there was a real buzz, and you just felt that there was something that was going to come of it. And I suppose in the late 80s, that all came true in a kind of huge explosion of dance music. But that period of kind of 82 through to kind of 80, 87, 88, and the first Summer of Love, and the kind of explosion of dance music culture on a wider level, was just a really, really exciting time. And I think it was a really exciting time musically as well. I think particularly in the UK, because there was, one of the things I think about a lot is this notion that in America was always a very forward-facing culture. Okay, so by the time you get to 80s, it's amazing. It's like America got consumed by the technological changes that were happening in music. So even people like somebody like, Robbie Robertson from the band would make a solo album where there would be a synclavier basically dominating the sound, because that was the flavor. This is somebody who'd come from really kind of roots music, and suddenly this synclavier was running the show. So, it's amazing how dominant the technology really changed the music then. And what was interesting, and obviously, by the time you get to the early 80s, you've got the possibilities of so much more in terms of electronic music, in terms of synthesizers, the advent of polyphonic synthesizers using sequencers, that whole kind of early electronic music, whether it's kind of Eno and the ambient stuff, and some of the Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk, of course, and all of those kind of things, which were all incredibly important and influential on the evolution of dance music later. But I think before we get to the kind of the explosion of house and all of that kind of thing, there was a kind of like this amazing period when anything went, and it was just much more, and it was more interesting because it was more about possibilities. But what made the UK different from the States, by and large, in broad brushstroke terms, if you like, was that there was very much a retro element to what. So our kind of taste spanned this a huge thing, Like on one level, it was okay. There's these electronic dance records coming out of America, and on the other level, you've got people like Sade, Working Week, who came out of Weekend, and a lot of stuff that was produced by that guy Robin Miller, where they were kind of like going, hang on, we don't want to abandon the sound palette of the 60s and 70s quite yet. We're going to keep the Fender Rhodes on the album, so we're going to, because the advent of certain keyboards, it was amazing how technology changes music, When the Yamaha DX7 came in, keyboard players worldwide would say, hey, I don't need to take an electric piano, I can just have a DX7. The DX7 will do the Rhodes parts. No, it can't. It doesn't sound anything like a Rhodes. It sounds ghastly. I mean, the DX7's got its own brilliant qualities, but as a substitute for a Fender Rhodes, it's not possible. So I think there was that kind of that retro element to the UK, and I think that was something that was reflected in fashion. And it was reflected in taste for music as well. There was this kind of thirst for digging into the past and for looking for things that still were relevant and sounded good, whether it was coming from jazz or wherever, really, So I think that was just a really, really exciting time. And I think you've got in that period as well, you've got that so many convergences going on as well. You've got the convergence of different kind of strands of club culture that started to come together. Like there'd been this kind of that whole kind of new romantic kind of element, and the kind of early 80s West End club ethos, all very fashiony and what have you. But that started kind of merging with more of the soul, but gradually the kind of influence of the soul boy culture and that started these things started to gel and to kind of cross pollinate around that time, and you started to have certainly some more specialist black music nights happening in the West End in a limited way, because I think when we can get deep into the politics of this, but I think there was a lot of kind of racist door policies going on back in those days and what have you. People talk about quotas and what have you, but it was definitely interesting in terms of that cross pollination of different aspects of club culture was going on. So I think there was, and then then you get to I suppose with the advent of what people called rare groove as well.
Yeah,
which was another kind of important thing that massively took over my life as well at that time. Because I'd finished my degree in 85. I went out and did a very dull job for a while.
What was that?
In sales. I worked first in telesales. This was the dawn of digital communication. So I was selling pages to companies so that they could keep a track on their workforce, and the kind of like the first kind of suitcase brick-like mobile phones and what have you. And I worked them in the telesales for a while, and then I did a little bit of time in sales with out with a company, Metro, trying to do the deals and what have you. And I became quite alienated from my musical soul, if you like, at that period. I was drinking a lot of vodka with my peers of a weekend, and it was all it seemed all wrong. And I just literally woke up one day and thought, hell, I need to get back into music, whatever it is, whatever way I can do it, I need to find a road back into music, because this is not where I want it. I could see a trajectory of my life which I just didn't want. I didn't recognise that, so I thought, so I quit that job and bummed around a while, still living in a squat, so my overheads were pretty low, and I got jobs working in record shops. Initially in Record and Tape Exchange, which was this, a group of shops in London that had this that was notorious because they notoriously employed a lot of graduates like myself who had enough knowledge to pass the test, because you had to do this written music exam to show that you knew your shit. But they would exploit us, and use us as casual labour in a few shops, and then you get dumped, and that's exactly what happened to me. But it was fascinating because as soon as I worked in a record shop, I thought, well, this is really interesting because firstly, I've got access to so much music, and I can buy loads of records really cheaply, and secondly, I started to meet lots of people who were, and it's like when you work behind the counter, you can clock and check what people are buying, So if you think this looks like an interesting dude who might have good taste, and then you see what they're buying and you think, okay. So you'd learn so much just like over the counter, that's that thing. So it was the beginning of my serious education into music, because suddenly I thought I've got a means by which I can put the pieces together. Because you've got to remember that, we always talk about this, like for old people like myself, back in those days, there was no resource. You couldn't go on the internet to find out stuff. Your music knowledge was gained from the back of record sleeves, from whatever relevant books you could find, and from some, music publications, what have you. That was it. So and there was, and vast swathes of music were undocumented and unresearched. So, it was just like, what's that? So, being behind the counter of a record shop, suddenly thought, yeah, this is a really good place to be, because this is where I can really start, accruing some serious knowledge, putting things together and meeting people, who are into music and having conversations about music, which is great, because my taste had always been really eclectic. So, I just was always fascinated to talk to other people who knew a lot about different kinds of music, or explain their passions for different things. So meeting people and other folk who worked in record shops, of course, they were all equally passionate about music themselves. So it was like suddenly being involved in a culture and having a sense of belonging, which had been seriously missing. I think, well, it was what I was looking for. I guess, in my life, that was the thing, and nothing. At that point, because I was so kind of alienated from what I thought I was going to become. It was just like, anything will do. This is all great. Just being involved in music was enough. I wasn't nurturing any dreams of becoming a great songwriter, a great player, or let alone a DJ. I was just thought, this is enough. I'm back into music, and music is there, and it's feeding me, and it's feeding my soul, and that was and it was great. But
had you not been doing bands then in that time?
No, because I think there was not really. When I left college, like my relationship with Robin the drummer has really kind of gone to pieces. I was still playing a little bit, and I remember, actually, funnily enough, there was a brief time when I got involved with a band with a guy called Rob Milton, who was a DJ who ran a really famous warehouse party called the Dirt Box, which was like a roving party that was really good. I think it was where Sade played their first ever gig, was at the Dirt Box. Wow. And yeah, Rob was one of the DJs there, and he tried to put a funk band together, and I got involved in that for a while. Unfortunately, his vocal chops weren't quite up to it, and some of the rest of the band. But we had a few rehearsals, and it was a lot of fun. And I remember covering things like Joe Cortum and So Much Trouble on My Mind, and all of these. It was good getting into. It was just nice to. And the drummer who was in that band, Wade, was pretty good, and I did a few jams with him at that time. He kind of brought his kit round to the squat, and because we had a little music room in the squat with kind of vague soundproofing and what have you. So for music, for those kind of musical activities, so we did it. And John, who was a keyboard player, who I'd been with, who I was involved in my first ever band, we occasionally got together, and I had a port studio, so occasionally we'd do a few little rough ideas. But I was kind of beginning to realise that this wasn't really going to happen for me, So the record shop thing was great until I got spat out by Record and Tape Exchange, and I was back to bumming around. And then I went one day. I had a friend, one of my closest friends, somehow had ended up renting a flat quite cheaply on Wardour Street,
Yeah.
And Soho was like, it felt like the epicenter to me of the world at the time. So that was brilliant. So you spent a lot of time hanging around with him and his girlfriend. And I was actually with his girlfriend one day because he was at work, and we were walking down Berwick Street, and I went, oh, there's a Reckless Records. This is another second-hand record shop, a bit like Record and Tape Exchange. And I just literally thought, I'm just going to go in there and ask for a job. So I walked in and asked for a job and bluffed it as a way. But I had worked for Record and Tape Exchange, but I said I was a jazz specialist, which was not really true at all, because it was like me completely winging it. But Andy, who was the manager, seemed to take to me, and I got my opportunity, and that was the beginning of my career at Reckless Records, which again was just like that was the absolute kind of total serendipitous moment. That was like the lucky coincidence that just suddenly that was like the dominoes beginning to fall, things clicking into place. Because at that time as well, I mean, like, the one thing about Reckless was I walked in there and I realised that this guy Jonathan Moore, who went on to perform Cold Cut and what have you, and Ninja Tune, Jonathan Moore worked there. And I was squatting in South London, and one of the parties that I went to regularly was his party that he did called The Meltdown in New Cross and places like that. And he was a good DJ that I'd heard who just had blown my mind, because he was playing like Fela Kuti and kind of and music that I couldn't even tell you what it was. Some of the stuff he was playing, like mad African records, whatever, and so. Yeah, so he was working there. So he was like a kind of hit, like one of my early DJ heroes, if you like. So I thought, brilliant, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to meet John Moore as well. So yeah, so I started working at Reckless, and and at that time that was, and if you like, that was just like the moment when kind of rare groove, the notion of rare groove, was exploding in London. So and also record shops were beginning to. There were already quite a lot of record shops in Soho, but they were kind of like, this was just before Black Market opened in Darblay Street, which was literally just around the corner. But it was that kind of pivotal moment when the kind of, if you like, vinyl culture was really beginning to embed itself in that area.
So, because there's loads of there's Sister Ray, Sounds of the Universe, isn't there? There was Groove. There's all these kind of legendary shops around there. What characteristics were unique to Reckless at that time? Did it have a certain music? Like, what differentiated it from the others?
Well, okay. So there was a guy, John Moore worked there. So he was kind of really into the whole. I mean, they were kind of currently at that time, I suppose a lot of people were really like searching out old funk records, right? So that was a lot of the rare grooves that people wanted, with these kind of like obscure funk records. And of course, a lot of DJs had realised that there was this list called Soul Bowl Records, which was predominantly a Northern Soul distributor, or selling to Northern Soul DJs, but who had bought up, vast amounts of, records from American warehouses of just black music, But the funk records weren't a particular, they weren't great currency for Soul Bowl. Nobody really wanted them. And so certain DJs were going up to Soul Bowl and digging and finding funk records and things, what have you. So there was that thing. So John Moore worked there, and there was another guy called Trevor St. Francis, who was incredibly influential to me as a DJ. He had a radio show on I think it was called LWR. It was one of the other big pirates at the time, and that's another element to my story as well, I suppose, in a way, was that pirate radio had kind of really fired my imagination as well. The notion that there was all these stations in London, and occasionally you'd hear some extraordinary music on them was something that I was kind of getting very excited by. But at that time, I was still really just very grateful to be involved, and I felt like and I was, and I knew I was winging it a bit. So I was just very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the record shop, and I just kept my head down and did my thing, to be honest with you. But Reckless was a second-hand shop, so it didn't have a particular ethos. It was basically what people sold to us, and then what we could sell to them, But within that, because we had people like John and Trevor and whatever working there, they could identify the records that were, that were of slightly higher value for the kind of, for the various factions and heads of in the kind of black music circles. And so those records would go on the wall behind the counter or what have you. And so, people, and it became, a place where a lot of people, if they were coming into gradually, as the record shops culture exploded and black market opened and there was all these other shops, people would come into London to go record shopping, but they'd always check Reckless as well, because, it was just on the circuit, and it became very much like a meeting place as well,
Yeah.
It was probably one of the shops where there was as much groupings of conversations and little clutches and gaggles of people just talking music. I mean, certainly a little bit later on, because I met so many people there. I met all these guys. I suddenly started meeting the Boogie Collectors. This was like when people never really spoke about. It was like before people even started talking about this music. I realised there was all these people who were fanatically deep into these kind of American dance records from a certain kind of period. A lot of them weren't that old, but a lot of them had never been, there was a lot of independent stuff that hadn't been released in the UK, and what have you. So a lot of it was quite difficult to find. But I loved them because these guys were really fanatical about it, and they talked about producers, which nobody else seemed to do.
Like the early 80s boogie stuff, like Kashif and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but like particularly producers like, the Patrick Adams, Leroy Burgess, all of these kind of guys, That was kind of like the more obvious end, but they were into all of the really obscure stuff and all of the really obscure New York labels and what have you. But they were into that kind of level of detail, which was something I really picked up from them, and really thought, well, and I was kind of naturally drawn to that level of scrutiny of record covers as well, of checking all the credits.
Yeah.
Because that was the way you could join the dots and make links to other things, and suddenly you started to recognise names and stuff like that. But it was an interesting period. Like I said, the whole Rare Groove thing was massive. The Rare Groove thing, a lot of that was based on something that kind of already had happened, which was like cutout records coming into the UK. Cutouts being stuff that was deleted basically in America.
That when the corners chopped off.
Yeah, and then when they took corners, so those cutouts would be, they could be bought really cheaply. So there were cutout shops, and there was a lot of titles that were never released in the UK, that became kind of Rare Groove classics straight away because they were great records. Things like James Mason's Rhythm of Life or Don Blackman's LP on GRP, these kind of records, and they'd been cutouts to begin with, but then as soon as those cutouts had disappeared, they were Rare Grooves, and the price started to shoot up, because there weren't that many around, so you could sell them for serious money. So that was, so I mean, I was into the cutout. I mean, when I was still squatting in Vauxhall, I remember there was a cutout shop in Elephant and Castle, and I remember going, thinking, these records are all $5.99. I'm going to buy lots, and I did. And some on spec, some that I knew of, some from, just like having an instinct about it or what have you,
When you say on spec, do you mean like based on the players and the producers?
Yeah, just having an instinct about it or whatever, or just getting something that I could latch onto, whether it was player or producer or whatever that appealed, or sometimes something that I'd made a note of because I'd heard it on a pirate station or whatever, Yeah. But I was still finding my way in. But when I started to work at Reckless, I started feeling like I was on the inside, because I was meeting so many people, so many other DJs, so many collectors, so many music heads and what have you, like I said, I was inspired by pirate radio, and then I suppose that was when I just started to get this idea that I would love to do radio. I wasn't thinking about club DJing at all, but I just thought, wow, I would start. By that time my collection was kind of growing and building, and I was hopefully had some kind of fairly fresh perspectives on some of the stuff that I was going to play, and I thought maybe I could do a radio show. So without really even thinking about it in an obvious way, I was just like, but I was also going into the shop every day, and we'd all take our own mixtapes or our own compilations in to play in the shop, So like obviously, and Jonathan Moore has just become one of the founding DJs of Kiss FM as a pirate station. So So I didn't think, I never said to John, "Oi, get a show on Kiss." It never got to that level, but it was like he heard my compilations and he was like, "Oh, what's this?" And what have you. And then gradually, and it was something, and then I remember I met Norman Jay and he was on Kiss too. And, and it almost seemed to, I don't remember ever asking for it. Organically, it seemed to happen that I was kind of like, well, you can have a little chat with Gordon Mack, who runs the station, and maybe you can do. Because they didn't, as much as they'd already kind of thrust their way into this kind of plethora of pirate stations as being the kind of hip one and the one that everybody was starting to take notice of. They didn't have a jazz specialist of sorts. So at that time, a lot of DJs would play a couple. Do you know what I mean? They might be into other things. They might be playing more boogie and soul, but they might play a couple of jazz tunes as well. Everybody wanted to keep a little toe in the jazz world as well, but they didn't have a kind of jazz special. They didn't have anybody who was kind of specialising in that. So that was kind of what I think it was sold to Gordon, that I could come in and do a more specialist jazz show. And I remember, this is a story I always tell because I think it's quite funny, was that on the day of my interview with Gordon Mack, it was, funnily enough, Kiss FM were based in Camden because they had a kind of legitimate promotions company called Goodfoot Promotions, where they put on their club nights and what have you. And it was, what was hilarious about it was that their studio, where they broadcast from, was literally on the other side of the corridor. And those days, the DTI, were chasing down pirate stations and trying to take them off air big time. But I think it was almost like it was a double bluff. They just thought, well, actually, we're just going to put the studio there, because you wouldn't actually think it would. You'd imagine that it would be further away. Or whatever. So the studio was there. But anyway, I had my interview with Gordon on a Saturday, and I got to Camden a bit early. I thought, I'll go to, because there's a branch of Record and Tape Exchange in Camden. I'll go and have a little shifty in Record and Tape Exchange, see if there's anything I can find. And I went in there and I found a couple of records which were great. One was Gil Scott-Heron's live album, It's Your World, which was like a seminal record for me, and I was kind of looking for it because I knew there was this live version of The Bottle which I didn't have, and The Bottle had been a tune which I'd been dancing to since whatever, and the other one was Johnny Hammond Gears, which at the time was a Mizell Brothers production that was a huge kind of jazz funk rare groove tune at the time, and I already had it, but it was £8, so I thought, well, I'm gonna have that as well. And so I went to my interview with Gordon, and like one of the first things that he said to me, and luckily I'd removed the price stickers from the records. But one of the first things he said, "What have you got in your back?" And I went and pulled out the Gil Scott-Heron, which I don't think he was particularly interested in. And I pulled out keys, and he went, and his eyes lit up. And he says, "Can I have that? How much do you want for that?" And I said, "Well, I said £15 to you." And he was like, "Yes," straight away. So he interviewed me. I got myself a radio show on Kiss FM, and I sold him a copy of Gears at a profit.
Nice.
All in one fell swoop. And it was great because Kiss was very clever, because they only broadcast on weekends, which was one of the reasons they were able to survive a little bit more easily than some of the other pirates. And they gave me a show on Sunday night at close down, right? So my show was nominally, I think, 11 o'clock until 1, but basically, because I was the last man on, I could finish when I wanted to. So sometimes I would just go on till 3:30 or something like that. If I had enough records and I was feeling inspired enough, I'd just carry on. And it was just literally like, I'd just say my goodbyes and then turn all the power off and lock the studio and go home and what have you. So I had this kind of initiation into doing radio, which was crazy because I just didn't know what I was doing, But how else are you going to learn to do a radio show? You just throw you in the deep end and off you go, And I always think that John Peel was a bit of an inspiration as well, because I'd listened to a fair amount of John Peel in my youth and what have you, and I'd always rather enjoyed the more amateur elements of John Peel, and when he put a record on the wrong speed or make a mistake or whatever, So I always thought that that you could probably get away with a warts and all type of approach to doing radio, and there'd be a way of styling it out. And when you're doing live radio, you've just got to make it work one way or the other. You have to kind of get through those things. So,
how did you find getting used to working on the mic?
I mean, I got, obviously I learned, dip the music, put the microphone up, speak, But it was very much, I was versed in that pirate radio thing where, and I like the idea, kind of like one of the things that we did differently from the BBC and what have you, from conventional radio, was conventional radio would play a record, it would end, and the DJ would speak over dead air. Pirate radio didn't do that.
Yeah.
You came in at the right, and that was the art of it in a way, was coming in a way where you could talk over a record without kind of upsetting anybody, in the right places or whatever, that's how I understood it, was that I was like, you can talk over a record and you want to keep this flow of music going. You don't want it to get to that dead air thing, because that's what they do. We do it differently, and you can be a bit more, and you can be a bit rowdier and what have you, but just find the right places to speak, whether it's just on the outro, or there might be a breakdown or a moment where you could interject and it would make sense. But yeah, I did that. But I also, I also relished the opportunity right from the get-go that I would say, right, okay, I'm also going to do a lot of back-to-back music where I'm not going to talk.
Yeah.
Because I,
did they just leave that up to you then? How much?
Totally, and that was because it was something that I'd enjoyed. I went back to literally to my youth, and like when I was first playing in bands, and I was a young teenager, and meeting this guy called the Major, who had a portable studio, and he had a Revox, and he would put compilations together on a Revox that were great,
right.
And I remember, sitting in his darkened flat on his big speakers, listening to this mix, and just thinking, oh, it's so great, this idea that you can segue different bits of music together and make this kind of, tell this story. So I always did that from the beginning. My show was called The Cosmic Jam. It was very much inspired by Lonnie Liston Smith and Cosmic Echoes, which is the name of his band. And that was my orientation, that I wanted it to be a bit more cosmic or whatever, and I was always kind of veering towards that more spacious, more spiritual, if you like, side of the music. And I would always say that in the second hour I would just let it run for however long, sometimes for half an hour, but for at least 15 minutes I would just do back-to-back music or whatever.
Yeah.
To start to, so you could have that moment of just a sequence of tunes that, for whatever reasons, and that would be also the most ambient and the most laid back element of my show as well, would be that beginning of the second hour.
Amazing. So yes, I think that brings us quite nicely to a point where we should pause, because I know we've got a lot more to get into and we've not got that much time because of school pickups and things like that. So let's pick up again in a couple of days, Patrick, and thanks ever so much for your time.
I'm enjoying it. I mean, it's crazy to go back over the story and kind of pick my way through it. I know it's not exactly linear in the way that I've told the story, but I think we cover most of the bases.
Oh, it never is.
Why should it be linear?
Yeah, that's it. Cool. Well, yeah, let's get wrapped up then. And
nice. Thank you so much.
We'll catch up again in a couple of days.
Indeed, we will. Thanks so much.
Great stuff. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Once a DJ. If you'd like to support the show, then head to onceadj.com/support to find out how you can help. If you'd like to get in touch with any feedback or suggestions, email onceadjpodcast@gmail.com. Once a DJ is produced by the good people at Remote Control. If you'd like to find out more about working with them, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk.
Was nice.